All right, thank you so much for being here, everybody. This is our third CWMEA Q&A mentorship session. Thank you to those of you who are watching this later, who might have been at the session last month. Thank you. It looks like all new faces this week or this month. If you weren't with us for the last session, that's totally fine. We have a video of that we can send out to your chapters so you can check that out. But this is a completely new topic with a completely new speaker, so I'm really excited that you're joining us today. My name is Liz Harvey. I am your Washington Music Educators Association president-elect, and today we have the awesome Haley Freedlund with us. And Haley is a trombonist, project producer, and portrait photographer based in Seattle, Washington since 2011. Having studied jazz performance at the Cornish College of the Arts, she is an improvising musician with a knack for theater production, arts administration, and creative problem solving. Haley is frequently sought after to collaborate on exciting and multifaceted works for the stage and beyond its confines. So thank you so much, Haley, for being here today. If you want to introduce yourself a little more and tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about in this session, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. So again, my name is Haley Freedlund. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. Very happy to be here and so thankful to have been invited. So I think that's like one of the first times I've really heard my bio read out loud. So just to kind of reiterate on what Liz said about me, I am a trombonist who focuses mostly in jazz and free improvisation. I am also by trade a producer, not necessarily in the like recording production sense, but in terms of projects, theater, curational producing, and I also do a little bit of photography as well, mostly working with musicians and dancers and people in the performing community. I've been based in Seattle for 10 years. I moved up to Seattle from Portland, Oregon to go to college at Cornish, and did not think that I would stay as long as I have, but I've been here for 10 years now. I feel like I got really lucky in terms of networking while I was in school and in terms of work right out of college, and there just hasn't been a good enough reason for me to leave yet. And so I'm really happy to still be here, working, performing, and kind of using Seattle as my home base, and being able to tour as well. And yeah, so in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight, I felt kind of funny being asked to talk about music education because I don't really identify as an educator. I have taught in the past, mostly private lessons and through music organizations like Seattle Jazz Ed, who do like off-campus and after-school music programs geared towards students ranging in age from like infants and toddlers all the way up through high school graduates and early college students. And I still do work with them, but it's not really my primary focus. Through teaching, I learned that it's just not something that I deeply enjoy. And I'm happy to like keep doing things like combos and sectionals and group rehearsals and like special projects. One of the things that I'm going to be working on with Jazz Ed this year is workshopping the idea of jam sessions, especially with regard to not being a man and not being like a straight white guy in a jam session, and just trying to figure out the ways that jam sessions haven't been working for young musicians in the ways that they can work better, to be more inclusive of all communities and people from all walks of life. And so what I'm going to be talking about instead are like the different ways that I've found work for myself, both inside of music, in like the very obvious ways that one might think of in terms of like a career in music, so like performing and recording music and presenting concerts and touring and things like that. But also in ways that I've been able to like continue doing work in the music industry without necessarily just being a performer, both out of like desire and necessity. I think if I was strictly doing trombone performance like 40 hours a week, like as a career, I would probably lose my mind. I just do better personally with what's the word? a diversified like set of work tasks and things to keep me interested and excited about what I'm doing. And if I'm doing one thing all the time, I feel like I'd get bored of it pretty quickly or just like burnt out. And so a lot of the work that I do is more in the realm of arts administrative work for nonprofits and as like personal assistant work for musicians who need help with things like putting out their records or producing like concerts on a larger scale than they're used to, or putting together a tour, marketing, using social media as a tool to market yourself. Like the obvious hand in hand goes with like the photography work that I do, that I can kind of promote myself as like an all-in-one package of a person who can kind of help you with all these things to further your career. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. So yeah, just kind of to reiterate what Haley just said, this is going to be a little bit of a different session. I know that we are the Washington Music Educators Association and the Collegiate chapter of that, but like you were saying, a lot of us want to diversify our careers. Not all of us see ourselves in the very traditional band classroom or orchestra classroom setting, and a lot of us want to have careers outside of being a teacher, for example, being a performer or a photographer, or I guess just in general, being able to take advantage of awesome people like Haley who have all of these many talents that can really benefit, even if you are a traditional classroom teacher. There are a lot of resources in the music industry and community that extend beyond what we know and what we see in the conference setting and in the clinic setting of being a music teacher. So with that, we're going to move right into our questions. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a Q&A session. So we reached out to our CWMEA members and asked for questions specifically relating to music industry and music entrepreneurship. And so a lot of you guys had really, really great questions. And so we're just going to jump right in. The first question is, did you consider being a teacher while you were in college? And this person said, I go back and forth feeling called to perform, but most of my peers are going into education, and that also seems rewarding. So what is your experience like? Have you ever considered being a teacher?
Yes, definitely. When I was doing my research on colleges when I was in high school, I kind of like figured that I wanted like a dream plan and a backup plan. And I had a band director in high school who was like very traditional in terms of like what the idea or like the archetype of a life in music could look like. And he always kind of shaped it like a triangle, with one point being performing musician, one point being composer, and one point being music educator. And he recommended picking two. And I thought that was like a really good place to start. But I thought that there were other directions that I could go. And so I considered music education when I was applying to schools, and I also considered music therapy, because music had really benefited me and a lot of the people around me when I was growing up. And so that was something that I was really drawn to. I applied to schools with both of those programs as well as performance degrees. And I ended up going with Cornish because of the faculty and the proximity to where I grew up. It felt like just far enough away from home to feel like a new place, and close enough that I could get back pretty easily if I needed to. And after my first year, Cornish being like more of an art school with like a specific kind of performative track, I wasn't sure if I wanted to only study music performance, and so I started to consider transferring to a program that had different options for study. And I ended up sticking it out because I was able to kind of like work on those things along the way as well. Never like really training to be an educator, but kind of like learning from the teachers that I was working with, like what techniques they were using with me as their private student or with me as their classroom student that I really liked. And at the same time, like techniques that my private instructors and classroom teachers were using that I really didn't like, and like making note of that and noticing what I would or wouldn't want to do as a teacher. And private lessons seemed like the really obvious step because a lot of my peers were going straight to private lesson instructing after college or even during college. Um, I never really felt like confident enough to be a private instructor, and I've since kind of like challenged that idea personally, and also like the people around me have kind of helped me challenge that too, which I appreciate. um, and I've had some times that I've like really enjoyed being a private instructor and being a classroom teacher. um, but yeah, I think that it's worth giving a shot, and like if it's something that's really important to you, then you should definitely pursue it. And there are a lot of different pathways to get there, whether you study music education in your higher ed, or if you kind of just go one step at a time post grad. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really great answer. And so I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about your teacher who said there's like the triangle of music careers. And so I kind of wanted to ask you as a follow-up, that does seem to be what people kind of assume is the main career paths for music people. So do you think this is, I guess for you, if your experience was that you were thinking either music education or music therapy, do you think that having kind of pillars of music careers as guideposts is a good idea, or should people really have an idea of the broader sense when they're getting started?
I think that it can be really good to have like those examples in front of you, but I think that you know, there's only like so much that you can get from like the college experience, because there will be like instances of what it'll be like out in the real world. Like you'll perform concerts and you'll interact with the people who help you put on those concerts. Um, like the person who curates the programming for like the concert series at your college, the people who work in the performance hall where you'll be performing, so like the stagehands, the lighting designer, the sound engineer, um, the head of the program who maybe does the intros, and like the interfacing with the talent at the head of the concert, the press that come and interview you. So I mean, like you'll get examples, and then when you really start to think about it, like there are so many different ways that you can work in like the field of music without just being a musician. So like definitely look at the programs that exist at your school or at other schools, but like take like a really close and like examining look at like at just everything around you when you're in musical settings, and like notice what those like other jobs are and like what those other positions are, and like don't be afraid to try them out or explore them, or even just like ask the people who are doing them like what they think about those positions and if they enjoy what they're doing.
Yeah, great. All right, our next question from one of our collegiate members is, what is the best or most unexpected advice you have ever received about being an industry professional?
Ooh, I wrote this down, so I need to make sure that I read it correctly. I have like two pieces that are like very obvious to me now, especially having like lived it. But just like not being a jerk and not being a flake are like two very easy pieces of advice to take with you right now and like try really, really hard to hold yourself to. People will remember if you're a jerk to them, like just flat out. And people will remember if you flake on them, like whether that means just like consistently being late or like being underprepared. And then like the longer piece of advice that I carry with me is to make sure that you understand what's expected of you in like every specific situation. Um, so that can mean like in terms of being a musician, like kind of what I was saying before, like just making sure that you know what time the rehearsal is and whether or not that means like being ready to play at that time or being ready to show up at that time, whether the rehearsal is open book or closed book, what the expectations are for the performance, what gear you're required to bring. Yeah, knowing like what would be expected of you on the gig if you're going to be improvising or not improvising, um, and just things like that. Just know, and then like outside of music, just knowing like for example, like getting ready for this tonight. I get nervous about everything I do, and I'm kind of like always afraid that I'm going to forget something. So I'm one of those people that like double reads and triple reads every email that I get to make sure that I'm not missing out on something. So like I was going through like my emails with Liz and making sure I wasn't supposed to have like a keynote prepared, or like a list of topics, or just like, I don't know, like some sort of presentation, and just making sure that like I had a very thorough idea of what was expected of me for this. And I was still kind of nervous, but yeah, I think just like being as prepared as you possibly can and making sure that you put in the effort to be prepared, so you have as little doubt as possible going into whatever you need to be prepared for.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think, like you said, it seems somewhat obvious when you say it out loud, but it really makes a difference when you're not a jerk and when you don't flake. And so my follow-up question to that would be, in this kind of era where we're thinking about a lot about mental health and taking care of ourselves, I think it's a lot more socially acceptable to take a step back from things when your life seems to be overwhelming or you may have overcommitted. So how do you navigate the difference between being a flake and actually taking the time that you need if you are overcommitted or in a situation where you need to take a step back?
Totally. And I think that you kind of just answered the question in the way that I would answer it, which is just to communicate it. I think that especially right now, myself included, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Taking like a longer break from like the way we were doing things and then trying to come back to it is a really strong and sudden shift in lifestyle and mental state. And just the way that we kind of rewired ourselves to navigate life through the pandemic. And now that we're reopening and going back to in-person events, there's a lot of like inherent anxiety that comes with that. Something that I've been meditating on lately is that, so like, for example, I really hit a wall personally and professionally a couple of weeks ago. And I'm someone who's used to taking on like a pretty heavy workload, and I try to kind of just like get myself to push through it because I can think about it in terms of like a beginning point and an ending point, like this too shall pass, that sort of mindset. But that was like pre-pandemic Haley, and post-pandemic Haley is not really like a person who can work that way. I just need like a lot more time to process and a lot more time to decompress. And the other thing that I've been meditating on is that like the workload that I had pre-pandemic was probably too much work anyways. And so like something that was really hard for me to come to terms with at first, when I hit this wall a couple of weeks ago, was that, you know, this is only like 75% of the workload that I had before. Like I'm not touring right now. Like I'm not in like a tech rehearsal right now. Like, why does this feel so hard? And I was talking to a friend of mine and he was like, well, yeah, like the work ethic and like the work lifestyle that we had and the amount that we were taking on before the pandemic hit was also unhealthy, but we were just like very, very accustomed to it. And so getting real about that has helped a lot, and helped me navigate like the feelings of shame and understand that like there's no way or no good reason to feel any shame about that. But it's really important to communicate that, because if you're feeling that way but you're not talking about it, nobody's going to know that you're feeling that way unless maybe they're around you a lot and they know you really well and they can kind of sense that something is wrong. And so figuring out how to send that email to just let people know what's going on, or like how to make that phone call, can feel really difficult, but it's really, really important. And the way that I did that was just by sitting down with my partner and being like really, really honest about how I was feeling and how I had been feeling that way for a little while and how it was really freaking me out. And my partner just recommended that I make the phone call. And like one of the things I had to do was step back from the festival that I've curated for the last few years. And I was really afraid to do that because it's like a project that means a lot to me. And I was worried about what it might mean. Like if I stepped away now, would I be able to curate it in the future? Would it change the way that the other curators thought of me? Would it change the way that people in the music scene thought of me? It was like all like everything just kind of like would go and go and go, and my mind would just sort of take off. And then I made the phone call and it wasn't that bad. Like the person that I talked to on the other side, who was also involved in the festival, was totally understanding and like wanted to just make sure that I was taking care of myself. And we made a plan for me to just like send an email to the rest of the curatorial team that he would like immediately reply to and support my decision. And then I sent that email, and then everyone on the curatorial team felt the same way. And they were like, wow, I'm like really glad that you sent that email. I'm feeling the same way. I'm totally overwhelmed. I think we should just like take a step back and kind of like just come back when it feels better. And so the moral of the story just being that like, you're probably like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, the people that you're working with are probably also feeling overwhelmed. I'd say 90% of people are feeling overwhelmed. So just being easier on yourself, and I think safely assuming that like everyone else is probably feeling the same way, and they'll probably be really thankful if you are open and honest about the way you're feeling too.
Yeah, just having the bravery to take that first step, because everybody gets overwhelmed at their own point, and it's probably good to assume that everybody else is in the same boat. Yeah. So our next question is a little more practical. It says, when you were just getting started in the field, how did you determine your rates for lessons or gigs? I guess this could also extend to your photography or your other projects that you do.
Totally. I love this question and I hate this question, because money is just like such a tough topic for so many people, myself included. I think it's one of those things that like it can be really helpful to talk to other people of like your age or your level, and then like other people who are like maybe at like a skill level below yours or like a few skill levels above yours. A lot of people have their rates posted on their websites, which I think is like very helpful in terms of just like investigation and trying to navigate that. But I think like a really good base rate, say for, let's talk about like lessons, for example. A good base rate for lessons, I think is just $60 an hour, like straight out of college. But I think it also depends on so many things, because you want to think about like how much money you've invested into your own education. You want to think about the value of your time. You want to think about like the amount of work that you would need to do at that pay rate to live comfortably, like how many students you would need to have in your studio to have a livable wage. And then you have to think about taxes. It's just like there's so many little things that you can think of. And so I started, I think at $60 an hour for a 1 hour lesson, and maybe just like 30 for 30 minutes. Half-hour lessons are a whole different can of worms. You can decide whether or not you want to do those. And then you want to think about travel rates. But I think that it's just a really good idea to ask other people around you, like what they're teaching. People your age, people in your instrument. And if you are someone who wants to have a bunch of students or have just a very small studio, that can affect your rate, because if you have fewer students but you want to have like the same livable income, you're going to need a higher rate per hour. But I think that the most important thing is to just like know the value of your time. I think it's really easy to give yourself a rate for anything that's under market value, because you want to be marketable and you want to be like the option that people reach for. And when you think about like the way that you shop, I think that can be really helpful too. Like if you're someone who's looking for the best deal or for the best bang for your buck, or if you're looking for like the best investment, you can think about like all those different ways that you shop. And I think that also if you give yourself a higher than market rate, or like an at market rate at the very least, you can navigate making your, whatever you're marketing, whether it's private lessons or something else, you can make that thing more accessible to people who should have access to it, but maybe can't afford access to it. So if you want to be able to, for example, in terms of private lessons, if you want to be able to work with low income families who might not necessarily be able to afford weekly private lessons, but the student has a really good work ethic and they're going to benefit better from like a weekly discounted or free lesson versus like a once a month at your market rate lesson. If you have a higher rate, then you can afford to maybe have like one or two students who are on a scholarship or a discount or a free lesson rate. And so I feel like that's like a very like full and loaded answer. um, but I think to summarize it and condense it, figure out what people your age are charging, figure out if that's affordable for you, and then think about equity and accessibility.
Yeah, I really appreciate the detail you took for that answer because it's one of those things where it seems like, well, I would just do it at this wage if everybody else is doing it. But there are a lot of factors, like you just mentioned, that you really do have to consider. So thank you for that answer. Okay, the next one is kind of a loaded question. It says, how do you balance being a full-time musician or just industry professional with the rest of your life? And this person said, especially as it relates to mental health maintenance and relationships.
Totally. I think this is going to be different for everyone. Ultimately, you know yourself better than everyone else, and so there's not like there's a template, but there's not really like a template, you know. And a lot of it is trial and error. At least it was for me. I think that you kind of have to hit your threshold to know when you need to step away from it. So, for me, a healthy balance of work and life is setting like some really hard boundaries. If you're someone who can have, like, for example, a day off here and a day off there in your schedule versus having like an actual weekend, like if you don't feel fully rested from just taking one day off, if you're someone who would use that day off to like get things done and then you're not actually resting in the first place, I think that's really important to consider and acknowledge. Especially in college, I think that like our boundaries in terms of rest and productivity are really, really blurry. And it can be a good time to start practicing that because it'll just get even harder like out in the real world, or just like the post-collegiate life. And identifying like what self-care is important. I think that there's this like surface level idea of what self-care looks like, where it's like warm baths and tea and like staying cozy in bed and like watching Netflix. But really like self-care, especially as an adult, is making sure that you're resting and getting enough sleep, making sure that you are eating and making sure that you're eating a balanced diet. Getting outside. For example, I did not get outside today because I was working and I just didn't make time for it. And that's like one of those things that I have to like get real with myself about, is that it's important to get outside. And if you don't do it, like you just don't do it. So like for me, like self-care is like setting an alarm on my phone to make sure that I'm like drinking 16 ounces of water every few hours, because like sometimes I can forget, and setting an alarm to like go on a walk. And not being embarrassed about setting alarms to do those things. But yeah, I think that it's like one of those things where like you just kind of figure it out as you go. If you're not resting enough, your body or your mind will tell you, and then you can get kind of real about what is and isn't working. I think being willing to regularly check in, whether you're feeling good or not. I think that like for me, that's like once a month or like once every couple of months, sometimes sooner or sometimes less, depending on how I'm like personally feeling in my life. But if I am having a hard time, there's usually a reason why. And I start by like looking at my calendar and figuring out if I've just like over committed myself to like too many projects on top of like an already existing schedule, or if I'm like not prioritizing just like rest, and instead I'm like maybe trying to go to like a lot of shows and like not being restful and like eating food that's not as good for me and drinking beverages that aren't as good for me. Um, and yeah, those like just figuring out like what I do and don't need to be prioritizing and being honest with myself about it. I think especially after college, it can be very easy to just like want to get out and have fun because like that's something that we're used to being able to do in college. And when you start working, it can feel like just like such a sudden change that you want to like kind of commit to like the creature comforts that you had when you were younger and when your time was a little more available to you. So just making sure that like you're being good to yourself, and figuring out like what that really means. And I don't mean to say like not having fun and like just like being a fuddy-duddy and like staying in and like I don't know, like roasting some cauliflower. I mean like being real about like just figuring out like the balance of everything, like the balance of your work, the balance of like the things that you really want to be working on. um yeah. And I had one other thought, like in terms of just like one thing that could be hard for me when I'm working is making sure that I'm making time for like projects like my own personal art or like my music. um for me, like that means like being really like scheduled and kind of just like blocking out time, like I would for appointments or for classes, um and like putting my phone away and just making sure that like whatever I'm working on has my entire focus. And sometimes those projects can feel really big to me, like working on composing new music for an album or a show can feel like such a very like big and kind of like terrifying just like item to do. And so like breaking that into smaller tasks and then breaking those smaller tasks into smaller tasks can be really, really helpful. um yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. And I loved what you had to say about the self-care aspect of it. It reminded me a lot of what our last speaker, Erin Keaton Howard, she was saying something about along the same lines of self-care can be treat yourself, but when it becomes only drinking a bottle of wine and eating an ice cream sandwich for dinner, that's not self-care anymore. And so finding ways that are really functional and can be part of your foundational core of just living. So like you said, sleep and nutrition and things that are, just basic to your everyday life and making those care aspects of your life. So I really liked that answer. All right, our next question is, what are the skills that you didn't realize you would need, but turned out would be definitely needed in your field?
Ooh, yeah. um this is like another one of those trial and error things. And so I'll give examples from like my own experience. um when I started working post grad, there were like things that were covered in, we had like a, what was it called? We had a class at Cornish for all music majors. Um, and it was like one of those kind of classes that like each week they cover like a different topic in terms of like a professional career. Um, and so they had like a person, like an accountant, come in and like talk about music taxes and like the things that you need to track and like hold on to. Um, and then like kind of how you might like market your, like writing a short bio and like marketing an album that you're putting out and like naming it and how to upload it to like a music streaming service. um, but there were a lot of things that weren't covered that I needed to figure out pretty quick. One of them was just like general marketing, like figuring out how to promote myself, and like the elephant in the room with that, and like in terms of like any career in music, whether it's a career in performance or education or otherwise, is that there's no kind of like one set track. There's no like mold, and there's no like obvious step-by-step path to any sort of like winning professional model. um, and so first like acknowledging that, but there are like certain skills that you do need, like general promotion, like just day to day, like kind of building, not like, I hate the term building your brand, but just like being able to just like be like authentically yourself on your social media in a way that like people enjoy. And for me, I think that just generally means like really like posting whatever you want that you care about. and like writing about why you care about it, that sort of thing. Having like general writing skills is really, really helpful. Being able to like write short essays or just like do any like sort of creative writing is going to come in really handy. And then like for me personally, like just improving like general communication skills, like being able to like comfortably talk on the phone with a stranger, kind of like having an elevator pitch for everything in your life, like having an elevator pitch for like who you are, and having one for like the projects that you work on and what they're about, and being able to comfortably socialize and get to know someone in person on the spot can be really helpful. I consider myself really shy and introverted, and so sometimes like going to a show, I feel like I need to just like hang back, but sometimes I also feel like I need to like introduce myself to someone that whose like work is really interesting to me, and like someone that I kind of want to collaborate with. And so just like figuring out how to push myself into an uncomfortable situation and talk to them, and yeah, just like figuring out like the art of conversation has been really helpful. And then what else? For me, like, and something I was talking about with a friend of mine, because he hired me right out of college to like work on a show of his in New York, which I thought was really cool. But he hired me as like the assistant director for this show, and it was like it was music, but it came with like a theatrical element. And he hired me for that job because the director, who was like really great and who I still like adore, and who was like really interested in music, didn't have like the understanding of like music notation, or just like hearing the music and knowing what was going on and being able to kind of like target a certain point that he wanted to like change a visual. And so using like the skills that I did have as a musician in non-musical but like music adjacent settings has been really important. So like in that example, being able to like understand big band scores and like general notation, and be able to read the score and listen along to what was happening, and then like take the notes from the director and be like, okay, like he was talking about like bar 217 in section X, and like that's where I would like make the note, and like that would make the communication between the different departments easier. And so like just really honing the skills that I was learning in college, and then figuring out what I did need to know along the way, and improving those skills and just making note of that has been really helpful. So that's like a kind of hopefully helpful answer, but the basic answer is that like you aren't really going to know what you need to know until you realize you don't know it, which is awful. But just being able to be a self-starter when that happens and like figure it out, and kind of like one of the previous answers, just like not being afraid to ask for help, I think can be one of the best skills to hone right now, because that'll get you really, really far.
Yeah, great. Okay, before we move on to the next question, which is really related to what you just talked about, I wanted to kind of touch back on what you were saying about being someone who identifies as pretty shy. And I know there have been a lot of conversations specifically in the music ed community about, do you have to be an extrovert to be successful? Because there's this emphasis on being the really loud and excited band director who can network themselves so effortlessly. And I just kind of wanted to talk to you about like, away from even the ed scene, do you see this kind of stereotype of musicians needing to be really boisterous to get their name out there, make their brand? Or do you think that people who are more introverted and maybe more shy can have the same successes and still be true to their personality?
You do not have to be extroverted, and you especially don't have to be boisterous to have a successful career in music. I think that it can come in handy, because I think that like there can be this, well, I'm not even going to say that. I was going to say that like being extroverted can kind of like remove the like sense of embarrassment or like self-doubt, but it totally doesn't. I mean, like I know lots of people who are extroverted and like will say something and then will worry later that they said the wrong thing. So I think that being introverted and being shy can almost work to your advantage. If there's a way that like you do feel comfortable, figuring out how to do that and fold it into your career can be like so helpful and beneficial. So like if you like think about your communication style, for example, if you feel more comfortable sending a text to someone than talking on the phone, then you're going to feel more comfortable writing about what you're working on and like figuring out like the language of your brand. Then you're going to be about like talking about things on video like this, or talking in front of a classroom. I think that it can be like really helpful to not have that kind of like level of fear, but like it's also totally fine. I mean, it just take like everything takes practice. And I mean, I've been playing trombone for more than 15 years now, I think, and I still get nervous before I play publicly every time. And I play like multiple times a week now. And so just figuring out like how to get comfy and do that in like a healthy and productive way. um, I would, yeah, just encourage you to like do the thing that scares you as often as you can. um, and especially with students, oh man, I mean, like students can be so scary because I mean, especially got middle schoolers, so mean sometimes. But like I think that yeah, you just have to get comfortable with it. And it doesn't mean that you can't do it if you're not extroverted or boisterous. It just takes practice, and maybe you have to pump yourself up a little bit more. That's fine.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of our members are really going to appreciate that reassurance. So, like I said, our next question has a lot to do with what I just asked you about. So it says, what have your experiences been like in the professional music industry beyond being a performer? And this person specifically said, I'm passionate about this field of work, but wondering if playing is the right fit for me. And I assume this person is also feeling that teaching is also not the right fit, but they want to be in the music industry.
Totally. Yeah, so like some we were kind of touching on this earlier, but there's just like so many different kinds of jobs that you can have in the music industry outside of education and outside of performing. um, there are a lot of them that I've explored. You can work in, let's just list some of them. You can work in recording. You can work at a record label. You can be a sound engineer. You can work on the marketing team for a record label. You can work directly with the artist and manage them. You can, in engineering, be a touring engineer. You can work front of house, which is like the engineer that goes on tour and kind of partners with the bands that they tour with. You can work monitors. You can work tech, doing like theatrical elements and stage elements, and do crew work. You can work in venues doing like event staffing. You can be a curator. You can be an artistic director. You can work at an arts nonprofit. You can be a music educator. You can be a program director. You can curate festivals and shows and concert series. You can be a booker in like a larger venue, or you can be a booker for a festival. Um, these are just like the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. The ones that I've kind of explored during college and post college have been like mostly in arts administration, working for nonprofits with like a musical element. I've worked in a bunch of venues in a bunch of different roles, from like I worked at like a host as at Jazz Alley when I was in college, and then I also worked in their office for their like nonprofit wing. Um, I've worked backstage at like larger venues. I've gone on tour as a tour manager, which is something I've learned I really like. One thing I've taken away from working the venue side and the artist side is that I much prefer working with artists than I do working with venues. But you have to try it out to find out. You can work as a social media coordinator. So yeah, I would say that um, if you're thinking about education, you should like definitely try it. And there's no shame in trying it and figuring out that it's not for you. I think that's true of anything. And there's this like weird, there's just like so much shame attached to everything, isn't there? Like if you get a degree in music education and then you go and teach and you find out you don't like teaching, there's like this sudden like crisis that comes to you and you just sort of like wonder what you just did with the last 4 years of your life. But like almost everyone I know works in a field that's unrelated to the degree that they got. Like I'd say like 90% of people I know. And I think that's not, like it's just not uncommon to, or it's not uncommon to do that. Um, and I think it's like not even necessarily important to have a degree, but maybe I shouldn't be saying that to a bunch of college students. But you live and you learn, you know? And yeah, I think that you can try something out and decide it's not for you, and that's okay. And you should never stop trying to figure out what excites you and what feels good. And yeah, like don't be ashamed of trying something and failing or just figuring out that it doesn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, then stop doing it. Like, I think that one thing we're seeing, especially right now, is like so many people are leaving the education sector because teaching is really, really hard. And like all the more power to you if you can do it. But there's no shame in trying something out for all the right reasons and stepping away from it because it either isn't the right fit for you or because like you realize it's just like not an environment that you can like be sustainable in, like an environment that's not sustainable to work and live and thrive in.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. And again, it's like one of those things where it's the ugly truth of just living and learning, like you said, but also it's important to find something that fits for you. And so our next question actually kind of relates to what you were talking about. When you're talking about all of these different aspects of the music industry, like being a booker or being, you know, a tour manager or things like that, this next question says, do you have any tips on finding a mentor once you're out of college? So I think it's really easy to find teacher mentors because they're everywhere, or like performer mentors because you can always go to a concert and find somebody who plays your instrument and sings your voice type. But how do you find people who do more of the behind the scenes work that college students may not get a chance to see in the collegiate setting?
Good question. Yeah, so I mean, my first piece of advice in response to that is to try and find a mentor while you're in college, because I think it's definitely easier then. Like you're working with a lot of people who are kind of meant to mentor you because that's inherently what teachers are supposed to do. Um, and a lot of like my kind of favorite professors in college have gone on to be like not lifelong because I've been out of college for 6 years, but like they're just like people who are still really present in my life and that I can talk to about things that are great and also things that are really, really hard. And I can rely on them for like emotional support and advice and things like that, but also networking, which is really nice too. They'll introduce me to people they think I should meet. But yeah, I think that in terms of finding mentors in your field, gosh, I'm trying to think of like some of the people who have like been really important in that way to me. So like in Seattle proper, for example, one of my like favorite work opportunities I've ever gotten was to be a tour manager for a drummer based out of New York named Allison Miller. She's a jazz drummer and she has a lot of really great projects going on, but the tour that I ended up working was Boom Tick Boom. And the way that I ended up getting that gig was she reached out to two people that are like mentors in my life and people that I work with in Seattle. One is the artistic director and executive director of Earshot Jazz in Seattle, John Gilbreth, who's like done basically like all the booking and been kind of like the head honcho of the Seattle jazz scene for many, many years. And the other is Wayne Horvitz, who I met just after college when he opened a venue in Seattle called the Royal Room. And he's also like a very renowned musician who lived in New York for a long time, then moved out here and raised his kids here. And Allison reached out to both of them and was like, hey, I had a tour manager that I normally work with, and she had a scheduling conflict, and now I need someone to help me with the tour. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's been a tour manager before, but someone who can like do some like long drives and like work merch and can just like generally help with like keeping the band organized. And they both thought of me from working with them in similar situations. And so to have both of them recommend me to her separately was really helpful. And that led to her becoming my mentor as like a person in the music scene who is just like really talented and like great at promoting and like is writing music that I think is really cool and is like a very awesome queer role model within the jazz scene nationally. So all of that was kind of just luck of the draw, but like I had to kind of like backtrack on that. I had been trying to get to know John Gilbreth better over the years prior to that, just because he's so present in the music scene, and kind of has his like finger on the pulse of what's going on in terms of like upcoming jazz. And I had been doing like a little bit of curatorial work and wanted to get better at it. And so just trying to get to know him better, and knowing that he existed, and just kind of like if I saw him publicly, just like saying hi a lot and asking how he's doing, not being afraid to email him questions I had. And if there were opportunities to work or volunteer with Earshot, like just kind of getting myself on those as much as I could. And then with Wayne, Wayne is someone I still work with now professionally and musically. I've been doing like social media work for his venue, the Royal Room, and for his nonprofit, the South Hudson Music Project. And I still play his music every week in his large ensemble, the Royal Room Collective. And our relationship has been up and down. I worked for him a few years ago and quit because I wasn't enjoying the way that that work was going. And it soured our like working relationship for a while, but he was still willing to be like real with me about like why that was happening. And I was willing to be real with him about why it was happening. And I mean, I'm working again for him now, and it comes with like better boundaries. And I think that you just kind of have to like look around in your scene for like who's doing what. If you want to do booking, like look at the venues whose like lineups you really like the shows that are happening that you want to go to, and then figure out who's booking those shows. Or if you want to get into lighting design, and you really like the way that the lights look at certain venues, like figure out what their rig is, figure out who their lighting like designers are, their LDs, and like shoot them an email. I think that there aren't really like a lot of opportunities within businesses to find mentors all the time, just because like when you go that route, like they're thinking about money a lot, and they're like, oh, well, like we don't have any positions, like we can't really support you. But if you go to the individual and like do the research to find out who it is and reach out to them personally, like I think it'll be a lot easier to kind of make that connection and to get that experience, and even just like get coffee with that person and ask them any of the questions you want. And even if it doesn't become like a long lasting like mentor mentee situation, you have that connection, you can communicate with them, and you have that rapport if you see them out in public, or like they'll think of you if they need that assist further down the road.
Yeah, that's all really, really great advice. And I think it's important to note, like, kind of what you were just alluding to at the end. The worst they can say is no. The worst they can say is I'm busy, or I don't have the time, or I don't want to take this on. And that's okay. You move on to the next thing. So,
Totally.
yeah. All right. I'm mindful that we are coming up on the end of the hour, but Haley, if you have time to kind of continue on with our list, we can keep doing that. Or if you need to run, let me know.
No, I'm all good.
All right. So everybody who's on this Zoom, if you need to pop out, that's fine. Again, we're recording this, so you'll see it up on your chapter's social media, and we're trying to get the CWMEA YouTube page set up. So stay tuned for updates on that. All right, so we'll keep trucking along here. This next question is my personal favorite, and it's actually coming from me in our correspondence over email, Haley. This one is, what is this professional musician archetype to you? And how do you think these implications, and what are the implications for a more progressive and inclusive generation of musicians?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. Okay, so um, what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this like musician archetype is kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier on in the call, with the triangular idea that my high school band director had of like performance musician and composer and educator. And I think a lot, especially as like someone who's not fully like 100% a performer, and like that's not the only thing I do, and that I have this other work within the music community, but not within that like triangulated idea, um, of like if you're not fully in those like within the triangle, then you're like not making it, or like you're not like the real deal. And I think that even if like the times are changing and like the way that our careers are taking shape and are structured is changing, there's still sort of this like idea that's embedded into us very young, like starting at home and like within culture, that if you're not doing music full time, then you're not making it. I think that there can be like this shame that comes from people in our family, whether it's like our immediate family or extended family or our chosen family, of like, oh, like don't get a career in music, like you're never going to make it, you're always going to be hungry. Or uh, what's the old adage about teaching, like those who can do and those who can't teach? Like I've always hated that. I think there's this stigma of like if you're teaching something, then you weren't good enough to make it out in the real world. And that's something that I've always hated. Um, and what I'm thinking about more in a like post lockdown world is that people just need to like do what they need to do to survive. And ultimately, as long as you're happy and healthy, then like who really cares what you're doing? And if music is one of those things that you're doing, then like you're a musician and you're doing it, and that's enough. And I want to like start changing the culture around that, because it's like it's one thing to kind of come to that realization personally, like for each of us, like no matter what we're doing, if we're doing music, we're doing music. But there's going to continue to be people on the scene or people in audiences that are going to be doubtful, whether it's like aggressively or microaggressively. Um, I know that I face a lot of that like within my own scene, just kind of like people who have been jazz professionals for a long time, and they've always been like mostly performers, and they see people who are like younger and on the scene, and like maybe they don't go to jam sessions as much, or maybe they are only playing like a couple of gigs, or they're like playing their gigs and they're not going to other people's gigs because they're working or they're getting rest on like the nights that they're not out playing. And they're taking that as like, oh, like this person isn't like fully invested in their career, or this person isn't like actually doing it. And like I've been really lucky to work with people who are like excellent musicians or excellent composers, um, or excellent like music professionals, and it's not the only thing they do. And I never doubt it when I look at them. Like, for example, I have a friend whose music I've been playing a lot lately, and he is writing music for like a modern big band for like the traditional big band setting, but also with like added woodwinds and with marimba. And it's, I think, like 21 or 22 people. Um, and he is succeeding at getting grants, and he is paying all of his musicians at every rehearsal that we do, and he's paying them at like a good kind of like union rate. And the reason that he's able to do that is because he has a full-time job in tech. And so I think that like a lot of people would maybe look at this person and be like, oh, like he's like doing music like outside of work, and like the job that he has is his work, but like the job that he has is his job, and he's able to do the work that he's doing in music because of the job that he has. um, and ultimately like he's living a life that's very comfortable and he's happy, and like maybe he has like those moments of self-doubt too, but I think that a lot of that has to do with like again that like culture within the scene. um, and so I obviously have a lot of like really big feelings about this. But I think that there's just this like space in which we can explore like all the different ways that like a career in music can take shape. And I know that like I am navigating that a lot because like my work is changing all the time, and I'm like really excited to learn different skills. And so when like somebody looks at like my resume or like my current workload, it might look like really sporadic, or it might look like someone who hasn't like really honed any specific skills. There's that phrase like master of, or what is it? Jack of all trades, master of none. And I think that like that shortened version of it, and like the part of it that we often hear is like a little negative in terms of its tone. Because like the entire phrase I think is jack of all trades, master of none, usually better than a master of one. And I was so excited when I heard that in full, because I think that is just like the usual experience of most people. Like even within that triangulated idea, that's not just one thing. Like most people don't just do one thing. Allison Miller, for example, the drummer that I was mentioning earlier, she has a full-time career in music and is definitely someone who like people look at and they're like, okay, yeah, that's a professional musician for sure. Like she lives a life in music, people know her name, she's in like all the publications, and like she's putting out records all the time. And she splits her time between touring and playing gigs and teaching. Like I think that almost every jazz musician you look at and point to and name is probably also teaching. um, and it's not like what you think of in terms of like a person being a performer, but like every performer teaches for the most part, or they like have other things that they do to balance it out. And I think for the same reasons that any of us do, whether it means to make ends meet or to diversify their work so they're not going totally crazy just performing, or just like stimulating their mind in a different way than just performing could provide. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think this idea of plurality, like you can have the and in your career. I think a lot of, like you were saying, this focus of master of one, where you have to be going all in on one thing, can be really limiting. And I think it can also be really daunting for our collegiate members who are thinking about, well, what if I don't like this one thing? Even if I like it now, what if I don't like it when I start my career or when I'm 10, 20 years down the line? And so just allowing ourselves to say, okay, there's this entire industry that we can explore and all these skills that we can just try out. And so I think that's a really important thing to just know about. All right, this is our last question before we get into the questions that we ask every session. And I think this is a really great one, especially for our collegiate members. It says, do you have any advice on marketing yourself and or groups that you're in the professional setting? Social media is a really great resource, but I worry it will be viewed as not professional enough.
I think it just depends on how you use social media. If you're someone who is maybe like just using it very personally, like posting pictures of your dog and like posting memes that you really like, then I can understand that idea of like not having a like professional social media presence. But at the same time, some of my favorite artists are just like fully sharing themselves, and not in like terms of like what they eat for breakfast, but like they're sharing their hobbies, or they are sharing like memes that they think are really funny. Like maybe you're like a composer, but also you're like really into sci-fi and you just saw Dune and it was like everything that you wanted it to be, and so you're posting a bunch of Dune memes, like that's awesome. Like I think that it's like a way to like more authentically get to know yourself. And so I don't know. I think that the people who are saying that social media isn't like a professional enough platform to use for your work probably aren't like very aware of like how powerful of a tool social media can be. Um, I think it does like depend on like how often you use it and how you use it, but I think that you can share as much or as little of yourself as you want as long as you're like really kind of just like keeping on some sort of schedule. I think that's like another misconception about social media is that if you're going to have a social media presence professionally, that you have to post like once or twice a day and you have to like really be on it and the content has to be super interesting and diversified and the graphics have to be awesome. But ultimately, like you just have to kind of have like some sort of regular presence for yourself, whether that means once a week, 3 times a week, once a month, like it doesn't really matter. But having something that um, like social media coordinators or booking agents can look to for examples of your work, or that they can tag you in to do like their job of promoting you, making that easier for them is going to be really good for you in the end. Um, and I think that you can totally use it as like somebody used the phrase like a living business card, which I think is totally brilliant and like a really great way to think about things like Instagram. I personally only use Instagram and Twitter and my Facebook account. I haven't ventured into TikTok. I'm going to try really hard not to. I think that's like just, I maybe like just missed that cut off in terms of being an elder millennial. But yeah, I think that there are like all sorts of ways that you can promote yourself. Having a really good website if you don't want to do social media, just like something that you can hand off when you're doing records. Having an EPK is really good. An EPK is shorthand for an electronic press kit. And that just has things like press quotes, like people that reviewed your album and like what they had to say about it. Having promotional photos or like a graphic that you use like for the record album cover, like the cover art. And just having all of that like info ready to go. Because a lot of times when you're having something reviewed or you're trying to book a show, they're going to want to know things like the person, like they're going to all ask the same questions. They're going to ask about the personnel, they're going to ask about the instrumentation. They might ask for like 1 or 2 tracks as an example of what you sound like or to promote the album. And they're going to ask for like a short bio. So just having all of that info like concise and well written and ready to go is going to be really helpful. And then yeah, social media is just like an extra kind of like step further, I guess, in terms of being helpful and promoting yourself. But yeah, in summary, use social media as much as you want. Make it fun. If you don't like it, then figure out a way to make it fun for yourself, or figure out a way to make enough money to hire someone else to do it for you so you don't have to do it and they can just think about it. I think that is really good advice too, just like across the board. If there's something that you need to do that you don't like to do, figure out a way to make enough money to hire someone else to do it for you, and your life will feel a lot easier.
Very nice. Yeah. All right. So we're going to move into our last 4 questions are from the list that we are going to ask all of the session hosts. But because this is a cool different format for this session, we're moving away from the questions that are typically like classroom and teaching based. And they're basically the same idea of questions, just focused more on what Haley does in her career. So the first question is, do you have any specific self-care tips for the transition between being a college student and an industry professional?
Yes, just like regularly checking in with yourself. And like the biggest challenge for me going from college to post-grad, and really just like any kind of like big scheduling changes, is creating structure for myself. So acknowledging like if my schedule is going to be overexerted and I'm going to have like a harder time making sure that I'm eating on a regular schedule, giving myself the tools to make sure that I am. So like, for example, if I'm having a hard time getting dinner between like my working hours and like the gig that I have after work, then making sure that I can at least have enough time to stop for a meal, or meal prepping ahead of time so I have food like on me that I can even just like eat in the car on the way. Not the most civilized, but definitely helpful. And if you're gonna go into like, for example, if you're gonna graduate from college and then you're gonna have like a bunch of free time before you like start a job in music education, or you start exploring like what work options you might want to pursue, I mean, don't be afraid to like give yourself a week or two of just like really vegging out and like getting the rest that you probably didn't get when you were in college, but also being like as strict as you need to with yourself to create structure. So like, for example, in my life right now, I have like 2 days where I work out of my house, and then 3 days a week that I've designated as like work from home days. And if I don't strictly schedule those days out, then I'm not really going to stay on track, even if I have a to-do list. So I wonder if I even have my notebook close by and I can just like show an example of like what I'm talking about. What I've been doing lately is I make a to-do list, and I order it in number of importance. And so it's like kind of messy because I crossed it out, and it might even be mirrored, but I break everything down into like the different kind of like areas of work I need to do. One is a series that I curate twice a month. One is like one of my day jobs that I get to do from home. One is like my freelance photo work. One is just like stuff that I need to do at home, like just chores that I need to make sure that I get done that I can try and do while I'm working from home. And so like the things that I made the most important on this day that I made this list was like remembering to wash my hair, starting a load of laundry. Like those were the things that I put like first and second. And then after that was like work that I need to get done in terms of like its importance or its deadline. And so it was like promoting the series that I curate and present twice a month, and then getting like some of the social media work for the Royal Room done, and then getting like photo editing done for a client of mine. And so that meant like I think I kind of like decided I was going to work on like one thing for 3 hours, one thing for 2 hours, one thing for 2 hours, and that was 7 hours of work in a day. And when I do that, I get much more work done. Like if I designate like a 3-hour period to do one thing instead of just saying, okay, I need to get these things done and I'm going to start right now, I'm going to stay way more on task. And so, yeah, creating structure and planning ahead and giving yourself the tools to succeed, and just trying to stay as organized as possible, especially if you're a disorganized person. But even if you're already organized, just trying to step up how organized you can be, and thinking like way in advance if possible, like thinking at least a few days ahead, but thinking even further if you can be really, really helpful, like in terms of 1 week ahead, 2 weeks ahead, 1 month ahead, 2 months ahead, and just always having stuff kind of like on the horizon so you don't forget about it and accidentally procrastinate it or intentionally procrastinate it.
Yeah, I really love how you mentioned finding a way to organize, even if you're just generally a disorganized person. That was something that came up in both of our previous sessions for the CWMEA Q&As. They were talking about I think the question was, do you have to be inherently organized to be a successful music educator? And both of them mentioned you don't have to be organized as in a person who uses a planner or a person who does lists, but you have to find a way that works for you. So I really like that you just reinforced that idea that they both mentioned. All right, our next question is specifically when you're performing or have gigs, do you have a pre-performance pump-up song or ritual that you do every time?
I wish I had a cooler answer to this. I don't really. If I'm nervous about something, then I just try to get myself as prepared as I can, like prior to like heading out the door. So like just making sure I'm practicing the material and then reminding myself if I'm nervous, like, okay, I practiced the material. Like I'm as prepared as I can be. If I'm really nervous, I do some like breathing exercises. Lately, I've been doing box breathing, which I like a lot. And box breathing is where you inhale for 4 seconds and then you hold for 4 seconds and you exhale for 4 seconds and you hold for 4 seconds. It's a like a therapeutic breathing technique, but as a trombonist, it's I really like durational breathing techniques that kind of like challenge you to work on your air. So that one feels really familiar to me too. But breathing is like a really good way to regulate yourself if you have any nerves. And then I mostly just try to like set myself up for success. And like the biggest thing that I do now that was like maybe a lesson that I learned in my early 20s was I try to wait until after the gig to drink. I'm definitely not like someone with a drinking problem, but I just find that if I'm like drinking like a pint of beer on the bandstand, I'm like more likely to get distracted because I'm in a lot of like musical situations where I need to be like keeping my eyes on the director basically at all times because anything can happen. And I think that it just has like it has better optics to the audience, to the people that you're on the bandstand with, to the person whose gig you got hired for, or especially like if you're setting an example as like the leader of a band. I think it's just best to like wait to drink until after you're done playing the music. And especially if like that's something that feels like it can get a little out of hand for you, whether you're new to drinking because you're like 21 or 22, or if you just like are starting to like recognize habits in yourself when you're in performance settings or when you're in like social settings, just being like very, very real with yourself about that. And it just feels so much nicer to have a beer after the gig is done, and like you can kind of feel good about that and be like, okay, like it's time to kind of like step into a different environment and just like feel better about that. But the only other thing I can think of that I do to like pump myself up is if I'm driving to the gig and I need to distract myself, I will either put something on and like sing along with it, like something that I know very well and I can kind of like zone out with, or I won't listen to anything at all and I'll just like sing really, really loud, or yell if I need to. It's like you're in your car and as long as the windows are rolled up, like you're probably not going to freak anyone out except for yourself. And yeah, as long as you're driving safely, then who cares?
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, okay. Our next question is, what is one thing you wish non-musicians knew about being a professional musician? Or I guess about like the music industry in general.
How weird our schedules can get. I have a lot of friends that even that I went to school with, and like going to Cornish, everybody was studying like a different art form, and a lot of the company that I kept were either other people in the music department or people in the dance department because they were in the same building. And so like a lot of them get it, but you end up like hanging out with a lot of people that don't, whether it's people in your family or like people that you meet in other settings, or like you're dating someone and their friends are in a different industry. um my partner is also a musician and comes from like a similar background and has siblings who were high school musicians but have gone on to work in like different professional fields, and like they have normal 9 to 5 jobs and benefits and vacation hours and like a normal commute. And so like scheduling can be kind of a nightmare. That's like the biggest thing that I have to deal with for the most part. And then like also my own family, just kind of like there are like just weird quirks that come with it. Like I'm almost never home for Christmas because I almost always have a Christmas Eve gig. And like it's just really hard to explain that like the Christmas Eve gigs pay so well that it's like really hard to just not work on Christmas Eve. And like I have like a different, I think it's just like changed my view on like holidays and things like that. Like they're I don't know, a lot of that stuff has never really been super important to me, but I think that there's like this societal belief, just like the importance of holidays, especially commercial holidays. And it's a lot harder to convince my folks to come up here to Washington for the holidays if I'm like not even going to be around on Christmas Eve. And yeah, it's just kind of funny little quirks like that. And then just like at the same time, like if you're working in like a freelance environment, like not having a consistent income. And so like if you're keeping company with people who have like salaried jobs and like more predictable schedules, and like not being able to say yes, not just for the scheduling issues, but like not being able to like afford a vacation or like afford like a really nice meal, or like be able to just like do things all the time, or like not understanding that like you need to commit time to practicing because like you have to kind of exercise that muscle frequently. And just like, I don't know, the social connotations that come with that can be really challenging. But I don't know, the people that give you a hard time about it are bummer people, and hopefully they either learn to understand it and support you in your career, or hopefully you find better company to keep. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for such an honest and open answer, because I think, again, like I mentioned with the question previously, some of these things are kind of the ugly truth of just the nature of our industry. It's not common. I liked how you said a normal job for, outside of the music industry, because, every career has its own quirks, but especially the music industry, it seems like. So yeah, thank you for sharing your
Yeah.
experiences. All right, our very last question is kind of a fun one. Do you have any funny gig horror stories, and how do you overcome situations like this?
Oh my gosh, I was trying to think of a really like good one, and I don't know if I have like a really really good one. um Mostly I just have like a lot of kind of like funny things and maybe some embarrassing things. When I was in college, like a college freshman, there was like an end of the semester concert for a big band, and the director of the big band like made a really inappropriate comment when he introduced me as like a soloist on like the last tune. And it was like one of those comments that like not only shocked me, but I think shocked everyone in the audience. And I was just like, wow, this just happened to me on stage in front of like a lot of people. um, and I think I was even 18. I don't think I was even 19 yet. And it was like such a, just a shock to the system, and like a lot of the ways that like misogyny, whether it's intentional or unintentional, can be. And like, you don't really know how to navigate it. And then there have been like other sort of things that have just like, I don't know, they're like cliche trombone things. Like every trombonist at some point in their career, hopefully when they're like still in middle school, but sometimes as professionals, like you throw your slide out for like a further position note, and you just let go, and your slide just flies off of your trombone, hopefully not hitting somebody in the audience or somebody in front of you, and hopefully not damaging your instrument. And then like other situations, there was like a show that I was a part of in Stanford a few years ago, and it was like a really great premiere, and like the band and the crew invited like friends and family and just like people involved in the show back to like the hotel bar to just like have a drink and celebrate. And like 50 people, 60 people walk into this hotel lobby adjacent to the performance venue, and have like decided to close even though there's like 50 or 60 people there. And so I think we just ended up like hanging out in the lobby until 3 a.m. And just kind of funny things like that. There was like a situation in the same night where like a few of us got trapped between like the two sliding doors of the hotel lobby, like between the outdoor world and the indoor world. And it was like this weird purgatory, which was funny too. But I think like all of these things are obviously like very different from each other. Like some of them are comical and some of them are embarrassing and some of them are like just like downright awful. And there are probably like lots of stories that I could like tell if I thought for long enough, but that dead air is just like not great for Zoom conversations. And so the advice that I would bring to you all with those stories is just that embarrassment is like awful and it's just like a part of life. And like for me especially, it has been really tough for me in the past to get over being embarrassed, and sometimes I get like so overwhelmed by it that I have to like leave the room or like leave the event altogether and just kind of like process it. And I think that it can be really good to like find healthy ways to cope if you're one of those people like me who has a hard time processing embarrassment and like not spinning out. But if you aren't, then just like remembering that everything passes and it's like usually not as bad as you think it is, and that life will march on whether you feel terrible right now or not. Just like any like hard feeling, it just kind of like, I don't know, sometimes the feeling stays the same and your capacity to manage it grows, and sometimes the feeling itself shrinks. And whether it's that or the other, it won't be so bad, even just in a few minutes or the next day or a week from now or a month from now or a year from now. And there are a lot of ways to find validation through that, whether that's just letting time do its job or talking to other people about it or like finding a way to laugh at yourself or just managing it. Like one of the things that I've taken away from tour management is that there's always going to be like some crazy crisis that happens on any project that you work on, but it's always got like every problem has a solution.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for all of these awesome answers and really, really great advice. I love that we were able to have a session that is so different, but yet so beneficial to our collegiate music educators. So thank you, Haley, for being here today. To those of you who are on the Zoom Live, you're free to go. Our next session will be in December. Just keep an eye out on our CWMEA Instagram for information on that. But in the meantime, stay healthy, stay warm as the weather gets colder. And again, thank you so much, Haley, for being here today. And please let us know if there's anything else we can do on the side of WMEA for you, because this has just been an awesome session. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Liz.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.